Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this roundtable on uh, development assistance in fragile and conflict situations. My name is Homi Karas. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to be with Aki Nishio. Aki is the Vice President for Development Finance at the World Bank. He's leading the replenishment of IDA, which will be happening later this year. And he will start our event by presenting an overview of IDA's role in fragile and conflict situations. Following Aki, we hope to have some remarks by the Prime Minister of Haiti, Garry Conille. We're having a little bit of difficulties in connecting with the Prime Minister, but hopefully we will get him online. And then that will be followed by a panel discussion that will be led by my colleague from Brookings, George Ingram. So with that, let me just take a couple of minutes to set the stage and to introduce some basically some numbers so that we're all speaking more or less from the same boat. So with fragile states, it's quite interesting, and I think really a tribute to IDA that they have systematically reprioritized fragile and conflict situations. You can see in the left panel of this chart that in the year 2000, beginning of 20 years ago or so, IDA was only lending something like 15% of its total credits and grants to the 39 countries that have been classified as being fragile. Today, that number is 41%. Because of that, IDA is now the top donor to 13 of those 39 countries, and it's one of the top 3 donors for 22 of the 39. So it's really a very substantial and significant donor. And you might think, well, this is something that many aid donors have been doing, but actually others have not been following the same lead as IDA. And in the right-hand panel, I've showed you the comparison between IDA and another very large donor to fragile countries, the United States. In this second panel on the right, we have excluded the amounts going to Ukraine and West Gaza. Of course, those are, sorry, the West Bank and Gaza. Of course, those are also fragile situations, but because of their size and their particular circumstances, I thought it was more appropriate to just look at the numbers when you take those out. And there you see that IDA has been IDA's share has been growing, while the share of the United States has been coming down in the last 10 years. So as a result, IDA has now contributed more than 20% of what we call country programmable aid, that is to say, the aid that is available in countries to be programmed by country authorities and their development partners. For more than 20% of that comes from IDA. Sometimes these averages can be a little bit misleading. And so we have a chart of country by country, how much countries are getting from IDA. We've also highlighted the United States and then other countries. And you can see that for 24 countries, IDA is contributing more than 10% of their total country programmable aid. The highest share being to Nigeria, where it's more than half, but also you see very high numbers in DRC, Ethiopia, and Niger. In some places, like some of the islands, like the Solomon Islands and Tuvalu, where there are other bilateral donors who are very important. In this case, Australia, IDA's share is lower. And then in some places, including in Haiti, where we hope to have some remarks that I've highlighted, the United States is a larger donor than IDA. So I hope this gives you a sense that IDA is the largest donor to fragile and conflict-affected situations. It varies, of course, across countries, but in most of the 39 countries that we are talking about, IDA is very important. So just very quickly, what are the 39 fragile and country conflict-affected situations? You can see here that they're small in terms of their share of GDP amongst developing countries, excluding China, of course. So only 7% of developing country GDP, a bit larger in terms of the population, about 20%, much larger in terms of the numbers living in extreme poverty in these countries. Probably something like 55% of all the people in developing countries, excluding China, living in extreme poverty, and an equivalent share of ODA. So this is really why paying attention to these countries is so important. I've put up for you a quote from the IMF that also suggests that these situations are particularly difficult because many of these countries are subject to shocks, including shocks from climate, but also shocks from conflict. And then because they have much less resilient economic structures, these shocks then in turn create additional stresses and additional fragilities and build on each other. And it's that cycle of shock, stress, additional shocks that needs to be broken. So with that, let me turn it over to Aki Nishio to present some findings and thoughts about what the World Bank and IDA is doing in fragile and conflict situations. Aki, over to you.
Thank you very much, Homi. Good morning, everyone. And also good afternoon to those of us in those of you in Oslo, where I'm at, and some other parts of the world. Let me start by thanking Homi and the Brookings Institution for hosting this event. It is also a great pleasure to share the stage with Mr. George Ingram and our distinguished panelists, Ms. Allison Miner and Ms. Elizabeth Hume. This panel is indeed very timely, as we are in the final stretch of our 21st replenishment round to secure renewed funding for IDA's next 3-year cycle, and addressing the challenges of fragility and conflict remains a critical priority. I am therefore glad for the opportunity to share with you how IDA has been a pivotal partner in supporting countries grappling with fragility, conflict, and violence up until now. The World Bank's and herein IDA's approach to dealing with fragility, conflict, and violence, or FCV for short, is guided by its FCV strategy from 2020 that runs until 2025. It lays out how the bank as a development actor can support countries in addressing the drivers of fragility, as well as mitigating the devastating impacts. The bank has come a long way in our understanding and support for countries affected by FCV in terms of where and how we work, as well as our risk appetite in some of the most complex situations. Today, I will focus on the financial support we have provided to fragile and conflict-affected situations, or what we call FCS, has evolved over the years, and most of the topics I will cover today are discussed in more depth in our two most recent papers titled Empowering Fragile States and Aid Circumvention, the elusive dream of putting countries in the driver's seat. So these are the two most recent papers that are available online in our website. Next slide, please. Let me start by noting that over the past 2 decades, official financial flows, or OFF, to FCS countries have increased fourfold from $16 billion in 2000 to $69 billion in 2022. IDA's contributions to this surge has been commensurate and increased over 6 times from 2.6 billion in 2000 to a peak of 16.4 billion in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, before declining to 15.2 billion in 2022. This overlaps a bit with what Homi was saying earlier. Next slide, please. OFF to FCS countries have been largely concessional over time, as you can see from this chart, but it is important to note that share of grants in these flows has declined in recent years. The share of concessional official development finance, or ODA, within OFF from all donors to FCS countries reached a peak of 99% in 2004 and has since declined by 7 percentage points. Most importantly, ODA grants have fallen from a peak of 91% in 2005 to 78% in 2022. The bottom line here is that concessionality has varied substantially over time, which adds an additional challenge to already struggling states. Next slide, please. If we zoom in on the last decade, IDA was the largest provider of concessional financing among multilateral donors to IDA client countries in FCV situations, which we call IDA FCS countries. From the chart on the left in the slide, between 2010 to 2022, cumulative OFF commitments from bilateral donors to IDA FCS countries totaled $433 billion, compared to $112 billion from IDA and $122 billion from all other multilateral donors. In 2010, IDA accounted for 37.5% of all OFF to IDA FCS countries from multilateral donors, and by 2022, this share had increased to 59.6%. From the chart on the right, oops, sorry. Did I get bumped out?
You're okay, Aki.
Okay. I just don't see it on my screen. Okay. So in 2010, IDA accounted for 37.5% of all OFF to IDA FCS countries from multilateral donors, and by 2022, this share had increased to 59.6%. From the chart on the right, IDA's OFF commitments to IDA FCS countries were nearly 5 times the volume of the second largest multilateral donor to IDA FCS countries. Furthermore, IDA stands out as the most concessional donor, with 99.7% of its commitments being concessional, including 43.8% in grants. Next slide, please. Our research on the global aid architecture shows that a significant portion of OFF circumvents recipient government budgets, with 4 out of 5 OFF-funded projects run by non-government entities as of 2022, limiting parliamentarian oversight and undermining country ownership. The quantity of OFF transactions implemented by non-governmental entities has grown more rapidly than the amount of money involved in these transactions, indicating a trend towards fragmentation in the financial size of OFF transactions. The negative implication of these combined trends is an increased burden on recipient countries, which, despite their weak and limited institutional capacity, have to deal with an increasing number of partners with different priorities and bureaucratic requirements, providing development assistance that is shrinking its size. This chart shows that there is a positive association between government effectiveness and the proportion of OFF channeled through national budgets, suggesting that donor countries do respond to the overall quality of governance when deciding whether to channel aid through a recipient country's budget. As you can see in the chart, countries with a low index of government effectiveness tend to have a high degree of circumvention of OFF, and the majority of these countries are also fragile and conflict-affected countries that we identified with the red dots in the chart. In most cases, IDA provides assistance to FCS countries directly through recipient countries' budgets and through technical assistance to build capacity and strengthen country systems and institutions, thereby helping to reduce the problem of aid circumvention. Next slide, please. IDA's priorities in FCS countries align closely with those of other donors. Emergency relief stands out as the top priority for the overall OFF commitments, with both IDA and other donors recognizing its criticality. IDA significantly contributes to this sector, providing 44% of multilateral OFF from 2010 to 2022. Strengthening governance in FCS countries is another shared priority, with IDA's commitments to this sector accounting for 65% of multilateral OFF contributions, reflecting its focus on strengthening public finance management and public administrative capacity. Next slide, please. Over the past decade, OFF to sub-Saharan IDA FCS countries nearly doubled, but became less concessional. From 2010 to 2022, OFF from all donors to sub-Saharan IDA FCS countries increased from $21 billion to $41 billion, but the share of grants in total OFF to those countries declined from 82% to 72%, while the share of ODA loans and non-concessional other official flows, OOF, increased. IDA has been a major provider of concessional resources to sub-Saharan Africa FCS countries, primarily through grants. OFF from IDA to sub-Saharan FCS countries surged from $3 billion in 2010 to $13 billion in 2022. Without IDA's increased annual support over the past decade, multilateral OFF to IDA's FCS sub-Saharan countries would have nearly halved from $237 billion to $126 billion, which would have been a 47% decrease. Over the same period, the share of ODA in multilateral OFF would have declined from 87% to 80%. Next slide, please. IDA's scale and size allow it to tackle multidimensional aspects of vulnerability, as, for example, in the case of climate financing in FCS countries. As you can see in this slide, IDA, the largest provider of climate finance to FCS countries among MDBs, supporting both adaptation and mitigation efforts. Between 2013 and 2022, IDA provided $26 billion in climate finance to FCS countries, representing 77% of the total flows from all MDBs. This commitment comprises $14.5 billion for adaptation finance, constituting 56% of IDA's climate finance flows to FCS countries, and $11.6 billion for mitigation finance, representing 44% of the total. IDA's unique ability to leverage concessional finance, multiplying every donor dollar nearly fourfold for recipient countries, generates significant additional financing to support countries' efforts to address climate challenges. This increased funding enables expanded access to green energy and bolsters adaptation and resilience initiatives. Next slide, please. Finally, another example of how IDA's scale and size allows it to tackle multi-dimensional aspects of vulnerability is on how it has been able to support IDA countries in debt distress with high levels of concessional resources. As you can see from this slide, OFF from all donors to IDA countries at high or in debt distress increased from $25 billion in 2010 to $51 billion in 2022, but the share of grants in total OFF fell from 93% in 2010 to 74% in 2022. During the same period, OFF from non-IDA multilaterals nearly doubled, but at significantly less concessional terms, with the share of non-concessional flows, or OOF, increasing sixfold. These trends suggest that when the debt situation worsens in a country, the financing terms offered by donors are not always adjusted accordingly, or at least not in a timely fashion. IDA, on the other hand, adjusts its financial terms each fiscal year based on debt risk, offering only grants to countries at high risk of debt distress, and a mix of grants and concessional loans to countries at moderate risk. As a result of this calibrated approach, which we call the traffic light system, IDA has maintained a high level of concessionality to countries facing a high risk of debt distress or already in debt crisis. Next slide, please. In closing, let me reiterate that IDA has been a pivotal provider of concessional resources, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and small states facing vulnerabilities and IDA countries facing debt sustainability challenges. Over the past 2 decades, IDA significantly increased its support to FCS countries, closely aligning with other donors to address complex challenges. Today, IDA is clearly a preferred partner in addressing the challenges faced by FCS in an increasingly complex and development landscape. IDA's scale and size allows it to address multidimensional aspects of fragility, including access to concessional climate finance and grant financing for countries with a high risk of debt distress. IDA's role extends beyond financial support to encompass strategic initiatives targeting FCV situations. This is achieved through a robust policy framework that emphasizes comprehensive country engagement, addressing the root causes of fragility and enhancing sources of resilience. Supporting the compounding challenges facing the FCS will continue to be a priority for IDA as we finalize the 21st replenishment. And we are working closely with our donors and borrowers to design a strong package that will allow us to continue to provide the technical and financial support needed for countries to prosper in this very difficult situation. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much.
Aki, thank you for that presentation. Homi and Aki have laid the background for what is going to be now a panel conversation. They've explained the relative importance of ODA and IDA in fragile and conflict environments. And Aki in particular has gone into the extent, nature, and the challenges of donor circumvention of the government. On the panel, and please join me now on the panel, in addition to Aki, will be Liz Hume, who's Executive Director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, which has been instrumental in informing the Global Fragility Act that was enacted in 2019 and in tracking its implementation. And third panelist is Allison Minor. In her last government post, she was the State Department Deputy Envoy to Yemen, and for the past year was visiting fellow here at Brookings, researching how to address prevention in fragile environments. Both have extensive history at the policy and program level on how the U.S. addresses engagement in fragile environment states. The conflict, as background, just let me say that the Global Fragility Act and the resulting strategy lay out innovative, comprehensive approaches to addressing donor engagement in unstable environments. I will be asking Liz and Allison to speak to their experiences and knowledge of the GFA and its implementation, and to extrapolate to lessons for the broader community in addressing development challenges in such environments. I will purposely build from this experience and lessons from the GFA and turn to Aki to talk about the experience of IDA. For those who are participating online, you can submit questions to the following email address, events@brookings.edu, or use the hashtag IDA21 on X and tag @BrookingsGlobal. So to start with you, Liz, the Alliance for Peacebuilding was a major advocate for the Global Fragility Act. What was your objective in pushing the Congress to enact the GFA, and specifically explaining the thinking why local ownership, which Aki mentioned, is so important and how it can be honored in implementation?
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad you're doing this on about the Global Fragility Act. It is, in our opinion, game-changing with regard to how we do business with development assistance. It hasn't been fully implemented, and so that's something I know we're going to talk about. But going back into why it was so critical is that the way we were doing business wasn't working. You know, in 2018, we hit record-breaking violent conflict records, and it's still increasing. And so one of the big issues that we were trying to address is how do we do it differently? How do we bring assistance in a way that is focusing in on and centering and prioritizing prevention and peace building? And that's what the strategy does that comes out of the Global Fragility Act. But just to make a point, and I also want to go back to the slides that the World Bank put up about how IDA is being spent. Looking at emergency relief is the biggest, governance, health, and energy. And that's not dissimilar to how the US government was actually programming its development assistance. And if you looked at any country, you would go in and you would see, okay, health was a major funding, education, livelihoods, et cetera, humanitarian assistance. But when you would look at exactly what was driving conflict or fragility in this country, let's say it was corruption or human rights abuses or et cetera, the amount of funding that was going towards the root causes of that conflict were minuscule. Absolutely minuscule. And that could be replicated in any country. And we took a look at a lot of the strategies and measuring and looking at what was being funded. And that's what we saw repeatedly. So it's not so much the quantity of funding that's going into these countries, although that is important. It's the quality, and it's how you're integrating conflict prevention and peace building and centering it at the strategy. Because that's one thing people also get wrong about the Global Fragility Act. I think it's just extra conflict prevention or peace building funding. Yes, it is, and that's great. But it's also about how this work gets integrated into the overall strategy. So, for example, in northern Mozambique, if your health program, your education programming, where you're having incredible, increase in violent extremism, how are those programs also? How is the strategy being integrated into peace building and conflict prevention as well? And so that's really a big key of the Global Fragility Act, and the part that it's probably the least behind. So that was really, if you want to say what was the biggest, driving factor, it really was the fact that we were not getting at the root causes and the drivers of conflict in the countries that the US government or everybody was working in. So it was really a rethink. Now, we wanted it to be all countries, but again, that's hard to change, the way a government works. So we did focus in on compromise on these priority countries and the priority region of coastal West Africa. And just to go down into the local piece of it that you brought up, yes, that was one of the key parts of the Global Fragility Act. It is about local ownership, right? And also local expertise, because you will see in Haiti and other countries, we have a tendency to stick with our US foreign policies or the way we're doing business. We just keep doing it the same. And so really the push behind that is to rethink how we are doing business and making sure that we are using the local context and local knowledge. And that might mean pausing. It might mean changing the way we're doing, where our policies and our funding is going into. So I'll stop there, but that's really, the reason why the GFA came about, coupled with the fact that we started talking about this in early 2016. It got adopted, passed in 2019, and the data that we had just show that conflicts and fragile states were growing at record-breaking speed was really an important piece of this to say we have to be doing things differently.
Thanks, Liz. And unfortunately, that trend of the growing number of fragile states has continued. Allison, you directed your attention in your research when you were a visiting fellow at Brookings, and in transparency, I have to say Allison and I worked together some. You looked at investigating the implementation of the Global Fragility Act and how the U.S. addresses such situations. Share some of your thoughts on your findings and particularly hone in on two things that Liz talked about. One is local ownership, and the other is she talked about integrating development, humanitarian peace building. You looked at how the U.S. is or is not integrating its diplomacy and foreign assistance and defense security. So talk about both those issues, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, George. And first off, just thanks to Brookings, to Hume for organizing this event. I do think it's really important, including in this moment, not only for the IDA replenishment, but also as you and Liz have articulated, the situation that we're facing with conflict and fragility globally. So one of the reasons that I was compelled to look at the Global Fragility Act and the U.S. approach to fragility more broadly is because I was feeling a concerning disconnect between the international development community on one hand and the foreign policy community, especially here in the United States, as it pertains to fragility. And I think we're seeing the consequences of this a bit in the slides that Aki shared, showing the contrast between IDA investments in fragile states and U.S. investments in fragile states. So on one hand, as we've already heard from Hume and from Aki, the international development community, including the bank, are increasingly focused on fragility because of the threat it poses to global development challenges. But within the U.S. foreign policy community, there's an attempt to actually pivot away from fragile states and towards issues like major power competition and global challenges like climate change. There's a real sense here that the United States allowed too much of our bandwidth and resources to be consumed by fragile states like Iraq and Afghanistan, and that now is the time to pivot. I do think that given the World Bank's stature, it can play a really important role in helping bridge this divide by demonstrating its own commitment to addressing fragility and also making it clear in its engagements with bilateral partners like the United States that tackling fragility is not solely a development assistance challenge. As Liz has discussed, the Global Fragility Act really was the most significant, most ambitious U.S. conflict prevention initiative in decades. And it provides a really, really great opportunity to address this divide between the development and foreign policy communities on fragility. It emphasized in the legislation the need for a whole of government initiative that combines development tools with diplomatic and defense tools, and it sought to elevate prevention as a U.S. policy priority. Unfortunately, in my research, I found that thus far, I will say it's very much the early days in the Global Fragility Act, and we have opportunity to really build on the work that's already been done. But thus far, the Global Fragility Act has fallen prey to the disconnect between the development and foreign policy communities more than it has overcome it. So the GFA is thus far largely seen as a development initiative, and its impact has been limited to a handful of pilot countries without a clear vision yet for how that impact will be broadened beyond the pilots. I think this is really clear in the current U.S. national security strategy, which mentions the GFA only once, and then just as a part of a subset of democracy promotion development assistance. In saying this, I do want to acknowledge that the Global Fragility Act is already making really noteworthy improvements in U.S. foreign assistance in many of the pilot countries. It's just we are not seeing consistent integration of diplomatic engagement or defense tools like security cooperation in a really meaningful way, or we're not seeing a shift in the larger U.S. foreign policy posture in the pilot countries. As Liz mentioned, the real innovation of the GFA was to say that conflict prevention and promoting stability need to be part of the whole U.S. government strategy in a country, not just its development assistance programming. So all that being said, I do think that the U.S. still has a really great opportunity with the GFA to build on the work that's been done in the pilot countries, but to do so, it will need to embrace the truly whole of government nature of the legislation, and it will need to improve operationalization of some of the key GFA principles. And this is where I want to touch on the principle of local leadership, which I completely agree is essential. I feel that transformative change in a country is only feasible if it is locally led. External actors like the United States, like the World Bank, cannot create the kind of transformative change that's necessary to stabilize fragile states or to address the structural drivers of conflict. What we can do is to support locally led efforts that already exist. But if we're going to embrace the principle of local leadership, it begs the question of what donors should do when local leadership is weak or when it is not aligned with donor objectives. This is a really tough question. I do think that the GFA provides a good opportunity to interrogate it. The original approach for the GFA, articulated in the US strategy, the Strategy for Preventing Conflict and Promoting Stability, or SPCPS, was to adopt compact-style partnerships with mutual accountability. And this is a reference to the model used by the US Millennium Challenge Corporation, in which the partner government really does take a leading role in designing, implementing, and overseeing the aid program, which is called a compact. But the MCC approach works because eligibility is limited to governments that have already met fairly rigorous benchmarks for governance and are demonstrating progress already on their efforts to combat poverty and promote economic opportunity. But most fragile countries cannot meet these benchmarks because they are fragile precisely because of weak governance, social services, or economic opportunity. So unsurprisingly, the US hasn't, via the GFA, been able to really adopt this compact style partnership. Instead, we're seeing some important efforts to improve consultation and coordination with the partner governments, but it's falling short of true collaboration. And by collaboration, I mean jointly setting goals, developing programs, and then jointly overseeing those programs. In some of the GFA pilot countries, I'll use Libya as an example, as Liz did, political instability makes partnership with the national government extremely difficult practically. The US is doing really great work to partner instead with local governments and civil society in those places, and is having impact. But at the same time, it's very difficult to then translate that local level impact to the national level. And then the progress on the local level is going to be vulnerable to changes within the national context and from the national government. So I really believe that identifying a more realistic approach to local leadership in fragile countries is important. Number one, to avoid the kind of unmet expectations with the host country that actually serve to erode trust and partnership. And number two, to ensure that the US and other donors can set more credible goals and then better target their efforts in fragile countries. I also think that the World Bank, given their country-driven model, can be really a really useful partner in helping the US identify viable areas for local leadership. But practically speaking, it will be more difficult in the highly fragile countries where the bank is instead limited to working through third parties. I think of Yemen in this case, based off of my experience. But I'll stop there. Perhaps that's a good pivot to Aki on this question.
Thank you, Allison. Aki, give us an idea of how the World Bank and IDA deal with local leadership when you've got weak and fragile governments.
Yes, happy to answer that question. So what IDA typically does when we have operations on the ground in fragile states is we work with the local leaders. One example I can give you is the project called SWED, and you might have been familiar with it. It stands for Sahelian Women's Empowerment and Demographic Dividend Project. And this has been undertaken in a number of Sahelian countries. Now, very recently, the American Journal of Economics published an article about the results from this project, which showed that child marriage actually dropped by 50% as a result of this project. And I have actually been to the field to talk to the local leader of this project. And the person I saw was a voodoo priest. And he actually talked about some of the things that we typically talk about on development. He was talking about ensuring sexual and reproductive health for women, and also women's empowerment. And I was really surprised that these words came out of his mouth. And what I found out, though, is that in this whole process of consultation and preparation and implementation of projects, we actually work with these local leaders, and they come to quite often share the kind of values that we have. So this is just one example. Another example I would give is the case of Afghanistan. Now, it's a very difficult country. We all evacuated completely when the Taliban took over. But now we are back in full force, and we are using trust funds and IDA to support humanitarian and basic needs kind of operations. There too, we must work with the local leaders because they are the ones who are the anchors to the communities. And you cannot bypass them. You have to work with them. You have to understand what they are desiring. And in that process, we often rely on local institutions, including NGOs, to really get a close look at what are the needs at this community level. Let me stop there.
Very good. Thank you, Aki. So back to you, Liz. The Global Fragility Act is noteworthy for acknowledging that the United States can't pursue the objectives of the act alone, that it must work in partnership with other donors, local organizations, the private sector. Give us your thoughts on the rationale behind the principle of acting in partnership and your expectations on how this might be carried out in fragile environments.
Sure. Before I get to that, though, I want to just make a couple of comments to respond to my fellow panelists. And I'm not here to apologize for or to explain the Global Fragility Act implementation in terms of the government side of it, but just to also realize that, you know, the GFA was adopted and signed into law the end of 2019. 2020 was an election year. 2021 was a new administration, Afghanistan happened, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, while we're hitting that 5-year mark, it is important to recognize that you're trying to, as someone in the US government said, you know, turn an aircraft carrier. And that's what you're trying to do here, right? And coupled with what's been happening. So just to keep that in mind. And Allison, I completely agree on the focus of great power competition. And, you know, what we're seeing right now are, you know, conflicts that are increasing. And yes, there's clearly great power competition behind it in many places. But someone in the US government said something to me really smart. Actually, it was at a session at Brookings when we were meeting there. You might not want to work on conflict, but conflict is going to work on you. And right, remember that? And that is so critical because this current administration, was very focused on great power competition, and prevention and peace building were, you know, we had to keep hounding a little bit to get that forward. Now, as a glass half full person, we did get the Global Fragility Act and the new strategy put into the new development strategy the US government just released. I mean, that's, you know, important. The last one that came out, in 2010, 2011, talked nothing about this. But you're absolutely right. We have to have more, it has to come from the top. And, you know, and that is really key. And that's where Congress has been really, really important on this. Representative McCall, Representative Jacobs, Senator Coons, really pushing this forward. So, you know, regardless of the next administration, that's something that we're going to have to keep focusing in on. So, you know, we have a congressional report that's due coming up. And, you know, working with the US government to make sure that any information, you know, for Congress that we want to show that's working. And, you know, the US government has been really, really helpful. They've been really, really good about working with civil society ongoing basis. So not, you know, here's our draft, take a look at it. I mean, but really working, you know, hand in hand on these results. So, but the one area that I think has been, and George, you asked about this in terms of the private sector, you know, we put that in there because the US government can't do it alone. The US government, you know, can't be the only country working on this. And the US government in the past has also, you know, stayed away from kind of what we've called those basket approaches, right? They, you know, everybody wanted to kind of keep their funding separate. And in coastal West Africa, this is where we've seen some incredible partnerships with the Germans, with IOM, with the Dutch, really working together on, okay, how are we working separately and how are we working together? And, I know that doesn't sound sexy and cool, but that's huge, right? That's a huge change in the way the US government has been working. So I think that that's really important. I know the US government is working really closely with private sector and the DFC in terms of how do you pull private sector in and work more closely with them, because what we know about the private sector is some of them have budgets or GDP that's bigger than a country's GDP, for example. And so governments can't do it alone. Governments have to be working together, both bilaterally and multilaterally with the World Bank and others. The private sector has to be involved. And one of the things I'll just say why the private sector is so critical to this, the Edelman Index, we just had them at PeaceCon not too long ago, and they talked about trust and social cohesion are down, way down globally. The one area that we were seeing increase is with corporations, the private sector, actually trust increasing there. And so this is something that I have to say the private sector also has to be more involved in. I know, there's also a fear of the private sector to be working with many of us because the fact that, they do something wrong, we tend to point it out. But recognizing that stability is good for the private sector, but also recognizing that they have a big role to play in terms of, especially in fragile state countries. One other thing I just wanted to say, I know you brought up Libya, and I know we were supposed to talk about Haiti today. What makes these countries so difficult is that they're not prevention countries, right? They're in the middle of major conflict, crisis, coming out of conflict. They're always going to be the hardest ones to deal with. And interestingly enough, the GFA originally was focused in on these stabilization countries. And there's a reason why it says at least 2 countries have to be prevention, because we were afraid they weren't going to want to work on these at all. And so it's just important to keep that in mind. Also, too, I know you called them pilot countries. We really, use the term priority, and we want to say that because and this is what we want to get at in the report going to Congress, is how do we take these lessons learned out of some of these priority areas so that it's not like 10 years and then we say, okay, what did we learn? How should we change all of our development assistance, right? It needs to be adapting and ongoing. And that's a real key part of the GFA, right? We can't, again, we have to turn that aircraft carrier. We have to do it a bit quicker.
Thanks, Liz. So Allison, you looked at coordination in your research, and you found that there was some improvement in sort of the pro forma donor coordination and call for moving beyond that to greater collaboration. Tell us what you found in, I would say, 2 minutes or so, because we're running up against the hour. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, George. And I want to use, I completely agree with what Liz has said, and I want to use that aircraft carrier analogy as well. I want to stress that, yeah, we're about, frankly speaking, about 2 years into GFA implementation on the ground, which is very early for the kinds of problems that we're trying to tackle. So we've seen steps forward. We've seen the GFA overcome really big obstacles to how a big bureaucracy like the United States does business. And that's great, but there are still many obstacles to come. And so that the challenge will be continuing to maintain momentum and the kind of political will from the top, Liz, as you reiterated, to overcome those arguably bigger obstacles that are coming down the road. And so I think we're definitely seeing that to your question on donor collaboration in the private sector. So I think the challenge now is to really drill down on specifically what those obstacles are, and then garner the political will to tackle them. And when it comes to donor collaboration, I think we're seeing a number of bureaucratic impediments. The United States has really extensive project development and oversight requirements that make it difficult for us to work easily with other countries outside of a standard, multi-donor trust fund format. As Liz has mentioned, the U.S. has overcome that challenge in coastal West Africa through a joint program that we're implementing with the Germans. Another challenge is that our donor strategy and budget timelines are often radically different. And I think this is a particularly big challenge for big donors like the United States and the World Bank. And then perhaps even more importantly, staff in the field are often just so busy overseeing their day-to-day portfolios that they don't have the time required to explore new forms of collaboration, and they aren't incentivized to doing so. So I think, again, these are surmountable challenges, but we have to be very precise in how we identify them and then seek to overcome them and make sure that we maintain that momentum. When it comes to the private sector, I think this is an even bigger challenge because of the risk appetite that Liz mentioned, but we have a great tool here in the US in the Development Finance Corporation to help overcome that. But in order to be able to leverage the DFC's tools, debt financing, equity investment, political risk insurance, we need to help DFC proactively identify partners in these fragile contexts where traditional partners aren't willing to engage, and then address the risk appetite question, because the political instability, environmental, social, and governance issues, given often weak regulatory environments, those are highly prohibitive conditions that make it extremely difficult for the DFC. And I think we've seen the DFC overcome these kinds of challenges in other places. I think about specifically their Africa Investment Advisor program that allowed them to surge investment in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of just a couple of years. So I think we're starting to see the GFA take steps with the DFC in this regard, but it's probably going to need greater specific prioritization of fragile countries, perhaps through a targeted investment requirement, a specific investment target for fragile countries, and that kind of deployed investment advisor approach that DFC used in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. Thank you, Liz. So Aki, we have a couple minutes left in this program, and please comment on the donor coordination, or leave us with any thoughts that you want this crowd, there are plus 200 people listening to this event, what you would like them to know about IDA's work in fragile and conflict states.
Thank you. So just a few quick points. As we heard, by 2030, up to 2/3 of the extreme poor will be in these FCS. So I think it's absolutely a must for us in development to focus on these countries. And I think what IDA has been doing is to focus on a number of areas to make the support to these countries more effective. One is to be more flexible. And somebody used the comparison to an aircraft carrier. I think we do need to be flexible and nimble. And what we have done in many cases is to implement projects through third parties, through UN agencies, through CSOs, etc. And in most difficult kinds of situations, that has proven to be quite effective. Another area where IDA is really working on is on partnerships. Because obviously, I think somebody said this too, that you can't do these things alone. It's so complicated. You have to join forces on the ground. And I think what we have, if you go to our country offices in Kabul or Port-au-Prince, you will see that. We have to work together. Another area is on knowledge, because we have learned from working in these areas, and there are lots of lessons learned that we can bring to bear in terms of what works and what doesn't. And the last one is, how can we bring in private investments? IDA has a specific instrument for de-risking private investments in fragile states called the private sector window, the PSW. And that has funded some very interesting projects in fragile states. We need to do a lot more of those. So I think these are the sort of things that we now aim to ramp up in the IDA 21 replenishment. We are now in the home stretch. We will be pledging in December in Korea, and the policy package will include these measures on fragile states. Let me stop there.
Thank you. In concluding, let me thank Homie for putting this program together, Aki for your data-driven presentation and participating on the panel, and Liz and Allison for being great discussions on the panels. And I wish everybody a good day and a good evening. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, George.